Good afternoon. My name is Akshar Panshaw, and about 50.7 million students go to school every day in the United States. And when you look at a student's First Amendment rights, the right to protest is actually guaranteed to us within the First Amendment. The First Amendment in the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the petition of government. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to show how exactly the First Amendment can be shown in a greater context of the nation itself. And this is actually done through a variety of different ways. Social media is one of the most important ones. Social media is defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as an electronic form of communication, which includes but is not limited to things such as Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and many more. So what this does is that these platforms allow students to protest in a way that they want, which leads me to my claim that students should be allowed to voice their opinions about social issues and government change, while also making sure that there's a set of understandable and reasonable restrictions that allow them to protect the greater good of all students. And when looking at this, you have to make sure that these students are also maintaining civility and that they're not making drug references or they're not talking about things when they shouldn't be, which is where time, manner, place laws come into play. And what this allows us to do is it allows a student to not only talk about their specific perspective on an opinion, but it also protects the greater good of all students. First, going into the history of protest, of student protest, you can see in the court case, Tinker versus Des Moines, that these two students formed these armbands with a peace sign on them in order to protest the Vietnam War. The school principal thought that this was illegal and that the students were exhibiting their First Amendment rights in an incorrect way. So these students, knowing their First Amendment rights, actually filed a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court judges decided in favor of the students, saying that this is actually part of their First Amendment rights. What Tinker versus Des Moines tells us in a broad sense is that speech made verbally in cafeterias, hallways, gymnasiums, locker rooms, anything, or even T-shirts, buttons, pins, like armbands, such as in the case, is perfectly fine as long as it does not harm the greater good or the learning environment of the student. Another case that helps us figure out what exactly we can or cannot talk about is Morse versus Frederick. Tinker versus Des Moines helped us figure out what we can say, but Morse versus Frederick is a great example of what we cannot talk about. As you see in the picture, this student holds up a sign, "Bong hits for Jesus." While this is a reference to marijuana and the legalization of marijuana, this protest is about an illegal substance. So the school's principal in this scenario actually suspended the student for 10 days and took away the sign because he was protesting on an illegal substance. The student in this case thought that he was correct and that the First Amendment applied to this. So he took this case to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decided against them and decided with the school, saying that the school was okay and perfectly legal to suspend the student and to remove his sign because it talked about an illegal substance, which was marijuana. And a real-life example of student protest today through social media is actually the March for Our Lives, which happened early this year in March. I'm sure all of us in our Twitter and Instagram feeds saw these posters and saw these flyers to come out and support this cause. But actually, 11.6 million different tweets, posts, or hashtags were used in a span of 2 to 3 months, saying March for Our Lives, in order to protest the gun violence that has been happening in relation to the Parkland shooting. This social media aspect has a great effect because in Washington, D.C., in March, 800,000 different people showed up in Washington, D.C. in order to support the cause. And that's just in Washington, D.C. And this was actually recorded as the largest student protest in U.S. history, in recorded history. And we see that this March for Our Lives program wasn't just in Washington, D.C., but it was in our community as well. We saw that at Lake Nona High School, there was about 15 to 20 students outside with flyers or with posters saying that gun violence should end, or honk if you think gun violence is bad, or gun restrictions should happen. So we can see the extent to which social media has been impacting our lives. And the government, as I said earlier, there have to be some type of limitations in order to restrict these students for their greater good. And that's what the government perspective takes into place, because they have to think about, should I protect the individual's rights or the greater good's rights? And it's pretty obvious to the government that the decision is obviously in the greater good, because the preamble of the Constitution itself says, promote the general welfare of everybody, even if it means restricting the rights of one person. And this means that they have to protect the greater good because that they're more important, obviously, rather than one person, the needs of many versus the needs of one. So going back to the Tinker versus Des Moines and Morse versus Frederick, these two court cases told us the general rule about how can the students protest. And what this showed us is that students can protest in any way they want as long as it does not harm the class classroom or the learning environment in general. And this can be done through verbal speech or through social media as well. And like I said, we've seen the impact that it has made today, because 800,000 people showed up in Washington, D.C., and the number might have been in the millions over the entire country. And the government has to limit these rights in certain scenarios. So things such as the Morris versus Frederick case doesn't even have to happen, where the possibility of harm in students happens, where especially in today's world climate, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to guarantee students' safety from things such as guns or drugs due to the increased violence and use of things such as guns and drugs. And we can see the implications of my findings, because if we look at social media as general, people used to say that, oh, if you want to make a change, just write an email to your senator, or just send a letter to your state and local representative. But what social media allows us to do is it allows us to come together and unite as a single group to fight for what we believe in and fight for what changes we want to make. Thank you. What questions do you have?
Two questions for you. First up, what information did you need before you began your research, and how did that information shape your research?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the information that I needed before was definitely what specific perspective was I going to take. Initially, I talked about how I wanted, like my first initial findings was talking about just social media as a broad perspective. And then I realized that that's way too broad and I need to go more specific. Then I focused on the First Amendment within social media, and more specifically, how students' protest can work into that. And I showed that through the March for Our Lives protest, where students are able to protest gun violence through social media as a means of support.
Thank you. And second question, what additional questions emerged from your research, and why were these questions potentially important?
Some of the questions that emerged from my findings is that what defines protest, and why do students have to have limited rights? And that's where, when I answer these questions, I have to figure out that the greater good is more important than the individual's rights. And that's where that question comes into play, where if we have to protect the greater good, it's obviously the most important thing, because the rights of many outweigh the rights of me. The rights of many outweigh the rights of one.
All right, cool. Thank you.